3 men lay dead on the snow of King Street, and 2 more would not survive their wounds. British soldiers stood with muskets still raised while the crowd pressed close. Within hours, Boston stood on the edge of open rebellion. But the shooting did not begin that night. It began nearly 18 months earlier, when British troops first marched into the town. In the autumn of 1768, British warships settled into Boston Harbor. On October 1st, roughly 700 soldiers of the 14th and 29th Regiments came ashore at Long Wharf under the guns of the Navy. Redcoats moved through the narrow streets, drums announcing that Boston now lived under occupation. Lieutenant Colonel William Dalrymple commanded the force, under orders from General Thomas Gage in New York, to protect the customs commissioners who had fled to Castle William after protests against the Townshend duties. The landing did not end an argument. It began a new one. Boston's selectmen refused to quarter the troops, citing provincial law that required barracks to fill before any billeting in town. Dalrymple answered with pressure and threats to invoke the Quartering Act directly. Negotiations forced a compromise that satisfied no one. Some soldiers took shelter in Faneuil Hall, others in the townhouse itself. Armed sentries now stood at the doors of colonial government, and the city's routines bent around regular troops. Customs officials returned from Castle William under military protection and resumed enforcement of the Revenue Acts. Merchants watched guard posts appear at key intersections, and patrols moved through neighbourhoods that had never known such imperial power. Parliament's authority no longer arrived as paper or policy. It arrived as bayonets in the street. Minor confrontations began in taverns and along the common, where the troops drilled. The occupation settled into daily contact, and daily contact created daily friction. The town also carried the economic weight of the garrison. Off-duty soldiers competed for scarce waterfront work and took lower wages than local labourers could accept. Boston's working class felt the pressure first, and resentment spread beyond politics into livelihood. Religion and culture sharpened it further, as predominantly Irish Catholic soldiers lived among a Protestant population that already distrusted the army. Brawls and insults became common, and discipline proved hard to enforce. Every week made another confrontation more likely. Boston's radical leaders used every incident. Samuel Adams and James Otis warned of the dangers of standing armies in peacetime and carried their case through broadsides and the Boston Gazette. The Sons of Liberty encouraged harassment, from boys trailing soldiers with insults and stones to merchants who served them only at inflated prices. Landlords refused to rent to officers, and social ostracism marked anyone who cooperated. Commanders ordered restraint, but individual soldiers retaliated on their own. By December, shock had hardened into hostility, and both sides assumed the occupation might not end. Through 1769, non-importation tightened and tempers wore thin. On February 22, 1770, a protest gathered at the shop of Theophilus Lilly, a merchant who defied the boycott of the Townshend Acts. Near the disturbance lived Ebenezer Richardson, a customs informer despised by the patriot community. When he tried to disperse the crowd and remove an effigy, the anger turned toward his house on Middle Street. The crowd pelted the home with stones and sticks, breaking windows and threatening entry. Richardson, trapped inside with his wife and daughters, appeared at an upper window with a musket and warned them off. The attack did not stop. Richardson fired into the crowd. 2 boys fell. Christopher Sider was only 11, the son of a poor German immigrant, and he took swan shot to the chest and abdomen. Samuel Gore, 19, was wounded in the hand and thigh and recovered. Sider died that evening, and many patriots called the child the first martyr of the cause. The crowd surged toward Richardson, and only William Molyneux prevented an immediate lynching. Authorities jailed him to await trial for murder. A routine protest had become a death that could not be contained. On February 26th, Boston staged a public funeral for the boy. The procession ran from the Liberty Tree to the Granary Burying Ground. Contemporary accounts place the crowd between 4,000 and 5,000, perhaps a quarter of the town. Sider's coffin carried an inscription naming him innocently slain, and hundreds of schoolboys walked in pairs behind it. Merchants marched beside labourers in a single display of grief and anger. The funeral hardened the town's mood and reminded everyone that violence could erupt from any confrontation. Only days remained before another spark found the powder. On March 2nd, the spark came at John Gray's rope walk. Private Patrick Walker of the 29th Regiment came looking for off-duty work. The rope makers already resented soldiers who undercut their wages through a hard winter. When Walker asked for work, William Green answered with an insult and told him to clean the Privy House. The exchange turned physical. Workers knocked Walker down and he retreated. Minutes later, he returned with 8 or 9 soldiers carrying clubs and cutlasses. The rope makers seized whatever tools lay at hand, and the rope walk became a battleground. The brawl spilled into the streets. Samuel Gray, a rope maker who would soon appear again on King Street, helped drive the soldiers back to their barracks. The fighting ran through the afternoon as soldiers returned in groups and met dock workers and apprentices who left their work to join in. Justice of the peace. John Hill arrived to restore order, but the damage had spread. The rope walk fight turned long irritation into open street warfare. By week's end, soldiers spoke openly of revenge, and civilians armed themselves against rumours of attack. Boston had become a powder keg. The violence did not stay at the rope walk. Running battles broke out through the South End, near the Liberty Tree, and along Fish Street where sailors gathered. Witnesses later testified that soldiers threatened revenge and swore blood would flow before the week ended. Officers tried to confine their men, but discipline faltered as soldiers slipped out over walls. On March 3rd, soldiers moved in clubbed groups, hunting rope makers and their allies, while civilians formed patrols of apprentices and journeymen who challenged them at corners. Rumours multiplied, alarms sounded, and church bells rang with false reports that pulled people into the streets. March 4th was a Sunday, and tension rose despite sermons urging restraint. Some soldiers sharpened bayonets and cleaned muskets while making open threats. Young men on the civilian side gathered clubs and staves. Threat met counter-threat. Boston moved toward the moment when an ordinary quarrel could trigger irreversible violence. The next evening, King Street would supply the setting. Around 8 o'clock on the night of March 5th, Private Hugh White stood guard at the Custom House, snow settling on the cobblestones. Edward Garrick, a wig maker's apprentice, taunted him over an unpaid bill supposedly owed by Captain John Goldfinch, though Goldfinch had already paid. The exchange heated, and White struck Garrick on the head with his musket. The boy cried out and drew a crowd. White backed into his sentry box as apprentices, sailors, and labourers pressed in, many already roaming the streets that night with sticks and clubs. Snowballs and chunks of ice struck the sentry, and church bells began to ring. White loaded his musket, fixed his bayonet, and called to the main guard for help. Captain Thomas Preston assembled a relief party and led them out with bayonets fixed. The squad forced through the crowd and reached the Custom House, where Preston formed the men in a semicircle, and White joined the line. The crowd swelled to perhaps 300 or 400, pressing in from every side. The line held with loaded muskets while the crowd closed to within inches. Objects flew, coal, oyster shells, sticks, and witnesses said men struck at the muskets with clubs. Voices dared the soldiers to fire. Crispus Attucks, a sailor of African and Native American descent, stood at the front beside Samuel Gray, and some in the crowd grabbed at the barrels. Richard Palms asked Preston whether he meant to order fire. Preston reportedly said no, noting the muskets carried ball. Theodore Bliss heard him tell the men not to fire, but the bells and shouting swallowed his words. Henry Knox urged him to withdraw before blood was shed. Neither side stepped back. Around 9 o'clock, the standoff broke into gunfire. A club struck Private Hugh Montgomery and knocked him down. He rose, raised his musket, and fired. Other soldiers followed in a ragged discharge that witnesses later struggled to reconstruct. 11 men were hit. Crispus Attucks fell near the Custom House steps, struck twice in the chest. Samuel Gray fell beside him with a mortal head wound. Samuel Maverick, 17, took a fatal wound to the abdomen and died the next morning. James Caldwell, a merchant sailor, was shot twice in the back as he tried to flee. Patrick Carr, an Irish leather worker, lingered with a hip wound and died on March 14th. Preston ordered a ceasefire, though witnesses split sharply on whether he had ever ordered the men to shoot. Some swore they heard him shout to fire. Others insisted he called out not to fire and that the soldiers acted alone. The crowd surged again, and Preston warned of more firing if it advanced. Bells rang across Boston as thousands poured into the streets, and men carried the dead and wounded away while blood stained the snow. By 9:30, Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson reached the townhouse and, from the balcony, promised justice and urged the crowd to disperse. It resisted, calling for vengeance and demanding the garrison's removal. Preston and his men stayed under arms at the main guard, while civic leaders and officers negotiated through the night, and militia companies assembled to the beat of drums. The Lieutenant Governor met with Colonel Dalrymple and the council, and arranged for the soldiers to surrender into custody. By 3 in the morning, Preston went to jail, and the 8 soldiers followed. The confrontation had ended, but the crisis had only entered a new phase. At dawn on March 6th, the selectmen went to Province House. Hutchinson received them at 11 and faced Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and other leading citizens who demanded the troops leave the town. He resisted, claiming he lacked authority to move them without orders from General Gage. The selectmen insisted only withdrawal could prevent more violence. Samuel Adams reportedly warned that 10,000 armed countrymen stood ready to march, a claim later debated, but effective in the moment. The Lieutenant Governor turned to Dalrymple and the commander of the 29th, both aware of their exposed position. Dalrymple offered to pull the 29th back to Castle William, but the selectmen rejected any deal that left troops in Boston. The break came when Hutchinson's own council sided with the town and warned that civil authority had collapsed. That evening, he authorized both regiments to withdraw as quickly as possible. Over the next days, the soldiers marched to Long Wharf and crossed to the island fortress under militia escort, disciplined to the last. Boston watched them go, ending an occupation begun in October 1768. The town meeting reconvened on March 12th to establish committees for public order. The empty barracks stood as proof that political pressure could force what petitions alone had not. But with the soldiers gone, attention shifted from preventing violence to fixing responsibility for what had already happened. The deaths still demanded judgment, and the colony could not let that judgment come from the street. Prosecution became the only path that could contain public anger and assert authority at once. That same day, the Suffolk County Grand Jury convened against Preston and the 8 soldiers. Samuel Quincy prosecuted for the Crown, presenting testimony on the march from the main guard to King Street and the shots that killed Attucks, Gray, Maverick, Caldwell, and Carr. Crowds gathered outside, and British officials watched with unease. Witnesses came from every level of town life, each recalling a few chaotic minutes. The grand jury indicted the captain and his men. The indictments carried a broader claim. They moved the affair from military handling into civilian criminal court, asserting colonial judicial authority over imperial troops. The justices set the trials for later in the year to let passions cool and secure legal counsel. Many residents welcomed a court decision. Others doubted any verdict could answer the town's loss. With the soldiers confined, the fight over March 5th moved to the courtroom and the printed page. Within days, the presses opened fire. The Boston Gazette described peaceful inhabitants cut down. The Boston Chronicle answered with an aggressive mob and a desperate defense. An engraving advertised 3 weeks later fixed the public image more than any deposition. Paul Revere, working from a drawing by Henry Pelham, showed soldiers firing in formation beneath the Custom House. The caption named it "The Bloody Massacre Perpetrated in King Street," and the phrase stuck. Copies spread through Massachusetts at 8 pence each, into homes, taverns, and meeting houses. The image gave Preston a raised sword, as if ordering fire. A detailed trial testimony disputed, but readers absorbed at a glance. Pamphlets followed, built from depositions the Patriot leaders selected. The town authorized a short narrative of the horrid massacre, 96 testimonies wrapped in an argument that blamed the tragedy on standing armies among free people. Loyalist accounts circulated too, and the dispute crossed the Atlantic into parliamentary debate. Competing accounts soon began to shape how the shooting would be remembered. In Boston, memory turned to ritual. By early 1771, annual March 5th orations retold the night as a defining episode, and printers carried those speeches far beyond the town. This episode has traced the long road to that winter night. The landing of troops in 1768, the friction of occupation, the death of Christopher Sider, the rope walk fight, and the clash at the Custom House that left 5 men dead. The soldiers withdrew to Castle William, and the trials that followed would test colonial justice. But the deeper consequence reached far beyond any courtroom. The events on King Street hardened a growing belief that resistance could no longer remain local. In the next episode, the committees of correspondence turned scattered protest into a network that binds the colonies across British America.